welcome to the Hero Show, starring the indomitable John Hersey and the irrepressible Andrew Bernstein. I am Andrew Bernstein. You are indubitably John Hersey.
You got it right again. I'm John Hersey. How you doing today, Andy?
I'm doing great, John. How are you?
Oh, I'm so good, and I'm so happy to be talking today about a hero, Joseph Priestley, who on this day in 1774 discovered oxygen. Pretty incredible guy.
It's a big discovery, because without it, we'd all be dead. So thank you. Yeah, I guess that's the way it's referred. I suppose the exact terminology is he isolated it, right, as a distinct gas.
Absolutely, he isolated it, and we should give due credit to a few guys who also isolated it around the same time, if not before. But Priestley did this independently and deserves credit as well. He isolated it, and he didn't come up with the name oxygen that we have today. He called it dephlogisticated air, and we can talk about why.
A little complicated, for a kid from Brooklyn. I prefer oxygen to dephlogisticated air.
Yeah, I prefer oxygen as well. Thank you, Antoine Lavoisier, for coming up with that title.
Great French chemist, right?
That's right. Yeah, a contemporary of Priestley's, and he would have only gone on to really lay the basis for chemistry that he did. Well, arguably, he only was able to do that because of Priestley's experiments. Priestley sort of he pointed the way. He gave Lavoisier some data that provided the hints that allowed him to then go on and do what he did.
Yeah, and we should point out Priestley's dates: 1733 to 1804, one of the great, maybe the greatest scientist of the 18th century Enlightenment. And in addition to his work in science, I mean, he's like his buddy Benjamin Franklin. He was just another extraordinary polymath. He achieved at high levels in writing in religion, on politics, on grammar, on in science. He was just an extraordinary all-around genius.
Absolutely. He was a polymath, and he wrote works on liberal political theory, bringing Locke's two treatises and Letter of Toleration to bear on some of the issues of the day, religious toleration. He also modernized education in Britain at the time. And as we were talking about, made some serious discoveries in science, and then wedded those to industry as well with a group that I know you're familiar with. You talked about him a bit in this book here, The Capitalist Manifesto, the Lunar Society.
The Lunar Society of Birmingham. They're like, for people familiar with Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, they're like the Gulch of real life. They're an extraordinary collection of geniuses that we could get to before the show is over. I suppose we should start with discussing Priestley's broad, wide, deep accomplishments. I suppose we should start like you did in science with the isolation of oxygen as a distinct gas, and several other gases also Priestley separated and identified, and then did seminal work in the field of electricity also, didn't he?
Absolutely, yeah. He isolated, I believe, ammonia, nitric oxide, nitrous oxide, a few others that I'm probably forgetting. But
yeah, there were a bunch of gases that he isolated.
Yeah, he was a very interesting guy. I mean, he sort of got into science in part, I think, because of Franklin's influence. So one of probably his most popular book in his lifetime was his History in the Present State of Electricity. And he had written a history book before this, which was a very, very popular history book, went on to be used at Brown, Yale, Princeton. And he argued in that book that the study of history is really important because it shows people the amazing progress that mankind has made. And it also encourages them to participate. So he was, in a sense, he was sort of a precursor to maybe Jacob Bronowski's, The Ascent of Man, that BBC series, to guys like Jason Crawford today who are studying progress. The rootsofprogress.org is a great site. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. If not, go check it out. But he was really interested in documenting progress And he was very busy with his teaching load while teaching at Warrington. And Franklin at that time was living in London. And Franklin every couple of weeks would go and meet with his friends, and they would meet at a coffee shop and talk politics and science. And so Priestley made it. He got himself an invitation, made it down to London, and convinced Franklin to help him. He said, I'm going to write this history of electricity, and guess what? You're going to be the hero of my book. Will you help me?
Well, I mean, that's a pretty strong enticement, isn't it? And Franklin encouraged Priestley. Franklin, of course, as we discussed in our show on him, also one of the seminal researchers in the field of electricity, encouraged Priestley. And Priestley's book on electricity became not only summarized the great achievements already reached, but broke new ground in and of itself. I mean, he's recognized as one of the great pioneers in the field of electrical research.
Absolutely, yeah. That was one of the things that Franklin said was, "Yeah, I'll help you, but I would like for you to do some of these experiments yourself." And Priestley was already interested in science and perhaps was doing some of this type of thing, but this, I think, really launched him into this field and into science more broadly. So Priestley ends up writing this book, a 700-page just magisterial work on the history of electricity. And this is really interesting because it's, some say it's what launched the genre of popular science writing. This book really connected the Republic of Letters, these gentlemen scientists like Franklin and Canton and several others. Well, Priestley convinced Franklin to let him have copies of the letters that they were writing back and forth to each other. So he got to tap in directly into this Republic of Letters and then broadcast this Enlightenment mentality, this sort of spirit of progress to the world at large. And this book became extremely popular. It's kind of ironic. He tried to write a popularized version of it, but it failed. It wasn't as popular as his 700-page version.
Yes, you reminded me, my dad subscribed to Popular Mechanics and Popular Sciences magazines, like that. And this is the beginnings of it. Priestley's work at seminal in this regard, right at the start of trying to bring scientific advance to the intelligent layman, popularize it and show its life-giving, its life-giving merit. How strongly advances in science promote human life at a very practical level. And Priestley, I think Priestley gets a lot of credit for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, he would take this mentality and he would bring it, of course, to Birmingham with him, and become a seminal, a very key figure of the Lunar Society.
Yeah. Well, you know what, Sean? To discuss the Lunar Society, just as a coincidence, just by a matter of chance, I have a copy here of the Capitalist Manifesto, the historic, economic, and philosophic case for laissez-faire. I'll put on my reading glasses, and I will read a little bit about the Lunar Society. But this was a collection of Lunar Society of Birmingham. This is in England, late 18th century, at the height of the Enlightenment. The Lunar Society was so called because its members met, during the full moon, because the roads were so bad back then that you couldn't see where you were going. There's potholes that'll eat your horse, and carriage, and the horse will fall in, break its legs, stuff like that. The roads were so bad they met by the full moon. But the Lunar Society of Birmingham reads like a who's who of scientific, technologic, and industrial talent in Great Britain at that time. First of all, James Watt, who perfected the steam engine, was a member of the Lunar Society. The leading inventor of the 18th century, I guess, along with Franklin. Those two guys were like the Thomas Edison of the 18th century. Matthew Boulton, the businessman, the industrialist, Soho Engineering Works. that Watt moved down to Birmingham to go into production with Bolton, because Bolton had the engineering know-how to actually implement Watt's designs and manufacture, mass produce the steam engine, which of course is known as the work engine of the Industrial Revolution, which tremendously enhanced human ability to manufacture consumer goods, starting, of course, with cotton clothing. But here's something about Matthew Bolton that I love, John. And you're right. Priestley was by 1780 was a member of this group. But Bolton was interviewed by all the literary people out there will know. James Boswell, the Scottish writer who's famous for The Life of Johnson. He wrote that famous biography of Samuel Johnson. Well, when Boswell came to the Soho Engineering Works to interview Matthew Bolton, Watt and Bolton were in business together. Bolton said what I think should be the motto of industrial capitalism. He says to Boswell, "I sell here, sir, what all the world desires to have: power." Now, of course, there's power to do good and there's power to do evil. And the steam engine, as the work engine of the Industrial Revolution, did an enormous amount of good, producing consumer goods, by machine, mass producing them, not just by hand.
And of course, there's political power, and then there's commercial power. We, of course, Matthew Bolton was talking about commercial power here.
Yeah, industrial power, right? Yeah, and again, you want to point out it's Econ 101. We discussed in Adam Smith last week, right? Who was a contemporary. Econ 101, of course, tells us that if the supply of consumer goods rises relative to demand for those goods, then the prices are going to tend to come down. And how do you enormously increase the production of consumer goods? You use machine power. You don't just do it by hand, right? Machine power. You have the steam engine was the first implementation of that. And so everybody was so poor back there to mass produce consumer goods, starting with cotton clothing. You brought the price of clothing way down, which is particularly important when there was so much poverty prior to the Industrial Revolution. But anyway, back to the Lunar Society. Erasmus Darwin, one of the leading medical men, botanists, and also another polymath poet, was a member of the society. Charles Darwin, one of Charles Darwin's grandfathers. Josiah Wedgwood, the innovative maker of pottery, who designed brilliant maker of pottery, who designed an innovative method for measuring temperatures in a kiln, which was a time-honored problem, and who, by the way, was Charles Darwin's other grandfather, was a member of this group. Just William Withering, a leading medical researcher who was also a member. He's the one who introduced digitalis into the heart treatment, cardiac treatment. It was a medication allowing successful treatment of the then fatal ailment edema or dropsy, as it was known. So there's this group of extraordinary scientists, technologists, engineers, and industrialists. So, but here, let me read from Catman. But it was when Joseph Priestley moved to Birmingham in 1780 that the Lunar Society reached its apogee. Priestley, chemist par excellence, Unitarian minister. We have to talk about his work in religious theory.
Absolutely.
Radical free thinker, personal friend of Benjamin Franklin, was one of the great minds of his or any age. Priestley isolated and described several gases, including oxygen. We already discussed that. He wrote his history of electricity in the 1760s. An innovative thinker in religion as well as in science. I love the title, John, History of the Corruptions of Christianity, a book officially burned in 1785. And Priestley's last years in Britain was sad, right? This mob burned down his home and everything, which we can get to. But let me just wrap this up with this brief discussion of the Lunar Society. During his decade, because it's really indicative of the Enlightenment mentality of that what you were saying before, that science needs to be practical and making money is a good thing. During his decade in Birmingham, Priestley served as science advisor to Josiah Wedgwood, as he had been for years to his brother-in-law, the innovative English iron magnate Iron Mad John Wilkinson. You know, love the names. Yeah, you know, he's like John Wilkinson was like, I guess he was the Tony Stark of his day. They called him. For those of you not familiar with Marvel comics, Tony Stark was Iron Man. But Iron Mad, M-A-D, Iron Mad John Wilkinson, he was called. He was, you know, he was a tycoon, a manufacturer of iron, and Wilkinson thought everything should be made out of iron. His desk was made out of iron. His bed was made out of iron. These guys are so colorful, you know. He had a big iron coffin in his office that was propped open to encourage visitors to, you know, to buy an iron coffin. And by the way, this was his brother-in-law, because Priestley married Mary Wilkinson, you know, Iron Mad John Wilkinson's sister. That the significance of Iron Mad John Wilkinson, beyond being, you know, a manufacturer of iron, which, you know, greatly enhanced human abilities to build stuff, and eventually, you know, led to the steel revolution. But Iron Mad John Wilkinson produced the machinery for the Watt and Bolton factories. Right? Wilkinson had patented a process for boring cannons that he adapted to boring cylinders for Watt steam engines with a new and matchless degree of accuracy. And it was Wilkinson's advances in iron and in boring the cannon and the machinery for the steam engine that made the Watt and Bolton steam engine ultimately viable. So let me just wrap this up here, because we'll see the practicality of these guys. The relationship between the great scientist Priestley, the father of pneumatic chemistry, and the industrialist inventors composing the rest of the Lunar Society was a microcosm of the Enlightenment's ideal of the close working relationship between theoretical reason and the progressive forces of inventiveness and industrialization. Priestley was no pure scientist. This is a quote here from a biography, from his biographer, Robert Schofield. Priestley was no pure scientist to be horrified with the suggestion that his work be turned to use. The mixing of science, applied science, and technology in lunar activities found a supporter in Priestley. And as an industrial research organization, the Lunar Society found in him also a paid consultant. For all the lovers of Atlas Shrugged, Priestley's like the anti-Robert Stadler. You remember Robert Stadler was studying cosmic rays and, you know, pure science, theoretical science. He had no interest in applied science when he called Galt's motor like a great piece of plumbing or something like that. You know, Priestley, the great scientist, like Franklin, recognized human life is the value here, and science needs to be applied in order to benefit human life. So we got to give Priestley and the Lunar Society members a great deal of credit, and the Enlightenment more broadly, a great deal of credit for that insight.
Yeah, absolutely. Jefferson would later say, he would later congratulate Priestley on a long life devoted to lighting men's lives, to just helping enlighten the world. And he did this in several realms. We haven't really talked yet about his achievements in the realm of government and politics, but he was a long time dissenter, and we should probably talk about his religious views, which really started to develop in his childhood. He was very sick as a kid. He grew up in a very strict Calvinist household, and they held that you had to have some sort of religious experience, some sort of conversion experience in order to earn your way into heaven. And Priestley had not, he was too young. He hadn't had any sort of experience like this yet. And so he feared that he would die and go to hell. And that was really the beginning of his questioning of the Calvinist faith and of faith more broadly. I mean, he was, of course, a minister and a Christian throughout his entire life, but he started to question the dogmas of religion. And a really helpful step in this was that his aunt, who he went to live with when he was a very young boy, his mother died, and he went to live with a rich aunt. His aunt was wealthy, and she loved to entertain and had all sorts of people come to her house and just, engage in wide-ranging conversations. And the young Priestley was very precocious. He remembered something like 107 catechisms by the age of 4. Just a brilliant guy. Was there to witness these conversations. And among the guests there were these very heterodox ministers that expressed these views, and they questioned things like, for instance, the divinity of Christ. Is Christ really a divine being? So later in life, Priestley goes on to a very free-thinking academy. And unlike a lot of other academies at the time, this one allowed people to discuss all sorts of topics. Nothing was really out of bounds. Free speech was very much valued. And he continued to develop just very heterodox views. And, after graduating, he was set up shop in a small town to become minister. I think it was Needham Market. And pretty quickly it became clear that they didn't take too kindly to his views and more or less drove him out. And this would be a theme in his life.
Yeah, sad one. Maybe we should get a couple of definitions too here, John, since I don't teach history in the American schools anymore. But you're right. He was some of the dissenting family, and he was a dissenter all his life, which means, of course, a British Christian, a Protestant who was not a member of the Church of England, right? Was not an Anglican or an Episcopalian in the United, as is known in the United States. And back then, the Church of England or the Anglican Church, they semi-persecuted the dissenters, even though they were Protestants also. But if you were a dissenter, for instance, you couldn't go to Oxford or Cambridge, you couldn't get a plum government job. You were pretty, in some ways, a second-class citizen. It's interesting. Some of these guys were Puritans, who fled across the pond to Britain's North American colonies, founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony, including Boston, and then persecuted other religious groups far more egregiously than the Anglicans had ever persecuted them. Right? But that's the history of religion. But right, Priestley grows up in a dissenting household. He's a dissenter all his life. Heterodox, good word. Someone who holds views different from the churches, whatever church it is, their orthodox view, their official doctrine. Priestley. So Priestley is one of the founders of the Unitarian Church, wasn't he? And certainly a devoted free thinker in religion, science, and politics. Through his entire life.
Yeah, that's right. He did help to found the Unitarian Church in England. And that was a church where you could believe anything and still be welcome. You could be a member there.
Yeah, the Unitarian Church today, some of their ministers are Marxists. I know that from personal experience. So yeah, they are a free thinking, Protestant denomination, without a doubt.
Yeah. So, I mean, the Church of England, there were a couple of different laws on the books that required you, even if you weren't a member of the Church of England, to subscribe to these 39 propositions of the English Church. And Priestley didn't want to do that. He didn't think that was fair. And he and his fellow dissenters opposed these laws. This is when he wrote his essays. I think it was titled Essays on Civil Government. Which Jefferson later paid a tremendous compliment to when somebody asked him what good books one could read on civil government. He included Priestley's book along with John Locke's and along with Algernon Sidney's. So,
Jefferson was a significant admirer of Priestley, including Priestley's free thinking methods in religion.
Absolutely.
See how much of a free thinker Priestley was in religion? Get this. He said that the only revealed religious truths to be accepted were ones that matched one's experience of nature. You go, what? The only revealed religious truths have to match our experience of nature? Oops. What does that do to miracles? Men living inside whales and virgins giving birth and women turned to pillars of salt and burning bush speaking. I mean, the whole Bible is going to be eviscerated by that kind of principle.
Yeah, Jefferson took on a project of basically trying to rid the Bible of all of these sorts of miracles,
Right.
and to get rid of any sort of irrational beliefs. And he took a stab at it, but then he actually wrote to Priestley and asked him to do the same project. It was in the last years of Priestley's life, and I don't think he got very far, but he actually took Jefferson up on the challenge and began writing just a new version of the teachings of Christianity, shorn of all sorts of miracles.
Right, and at least in part, it was Priestley's influence that inspired Jefferson to do that in his own Bible. Right, the only revealed truths are ones that match our experience of nature. Well, that's really, there aren't any revealed truths. Then they were just that based on, that depend upon revelation of faith. Religion is becoming increasingly a type of science. And when I was boning up on this last night in preparation for the show, John, I was reading. Not surprising that Priestley's writings on this irritated both the scientists and the religionists, because the scientists didn't want science tied to religion, and the religionists certainly didn't want this scientific method introduced into religion. So Priestley had a way of making enemies, didn't he?
Yeah, he sure did, and that drove him eventually to take up residence in America. We can talk about his support for the French Revolution. He thought overthrowing monarchy, that's a great thing. I don't think he knew the extent of the horrors that were going on there, but
his buddy Jefferson supported the French Revolution strongly also.
Absolutely, yeah, both of them. So I think it was 1791. Priestley is in England, and his views on the French Revolution. So he and his friends decided to get together to celebrate Bastille Day. They wanted to throw a little party and have some food and drinks. Well, the local officials did not much like that, and some speculate that they are the ones who orchestrated what became known as the Birmingham riots, which is 3 days of absolute mayhem, house burnings, church burnings. 27 houses in total burned to the ground, including Priestley's. All of his experimental, all of his laboratory equipment, all of his findings, all of his belongings in the house burned to the ground.
Yeah, his library, his laboratory. It's not it's a tragedy for him, but it's an atrocity. Regardless, the English populace view on the French Revolution, and in some ways they were right. Like you were saying about the atrocities in the French Revolution. In some ways they were right, but Priestley, you obviously can't burn down somebody's house because they disagree with your political or religious views. And at least of all, a great genius like Priestley is pushing back frontiers of knowledge in like 3 or 4 different fields. So it's an atrocity to. And so Priestley had to decamp, didn't he?
Yeah, we have to wonder what was lost in that fire. Luckily, Priestley did live about a little more than a decade after that, but he shortly thereafter moved to America. He moved outside of Philadelphia. Several people were disappointed with that. Franklin had wished that he had moved to Philadelphia, and Jefferson said, well, why didn't you come check out Virginia first? We have better soil, better air. It's healthier here. You should have come here. Jefferson, of course, becomes president, and one of the first things he does as president is he hears that Priestley is sick, and writes him a letter just saying, mankind needs you, don't die.
All right, Mr. President, you have a lot of power, Mr. President. But I don't know if you could ban illness and and death. But yeah, the politics here is important. The American Revolution, of course, is unqualifiedly good. Priestley supported it. The French Revolution is very mixed, bloody hell, unleashed by the terror. People like Robespierre, as a prime example. So I can understand the English populace here, the bloodshed, the wiping out the aristocrats and their families, including little kids, and then the revolution eating its own, killing off all the revolutionaries. It was a bloodbath. Madame Guillotine, of course, was fed constantly and with many innocent victims, including children. So I understand the British rejecting that. And of course, they were still supporting monarchy, and the French had chopped off the king's head. So there were mixed reasons here for opposing the French Revolution. But I certainly understand part of it is a very mixed case. Although at the end of the day, even though the French Revolution spawned Napoleon, imperialism, a lot of lives lost in endless war, the Napoleonic Wars. At the end of the day, the French Revolution, in the big picture, did succeed in producing freedom and a republic in France by the mid to late 19th century. It was a long, bloody struggle. But anyhow, so you can understand the good things in the French Revolution. Priestley supported it, but you can see why Priestley moved to America, not to France. I mean, one reason he spoke English fluently and not French, but I think the other reason was the United States wasn't a bloodbath. You know, if he had gone to France during the Revolution, John, he probably at first would have been defeated and eventually executed. He probably would have chopped off his head eventually. So he made a wise choice to cross the pond and come to the United States.
Yeah, I believe one of his sons moved to France shortly before, and Priestley was offered citizenship in France. He accepted the citizenship but never went. He left England about 5 weeks before William Pitt, of all people, began basically rounding up people for libel. So he made it out of England just in time. Probably would have been arrested. No doubt would have been arrested.
Yeah, Dynamite Joe was he known as Dynamite Joe because in one of his right. writings he didn't mince words. One of his writings he talked about. He's speaking metaphorically, I think, but dynamiting the establishment here, of the Anglican Church and the Orthodoxy and the monarchy and everything. So he got his enemies started to call him Joseph Priestley, who spoke metaphorically of dynamiting the political religious establishment. They called him Dynamite Joe. I don't think anybody's going to call Joe Biden that, but
no, but, absolutely not.
But Joseph Priestley, yeah. So I think, no doubt. I think you're predicting what would have happened when it didn't happen, is a fool's errand. But I think you're right. The chances are very strong that Priestley would have been arrested and brought up on charges in Britain. So he got out of Dodge just in time. I think you're absolutely right. And America was the perfect place for him.
Yeah, so he sets up shop in America, and he's less active in these last few years of his life. But one of the key things that he does is consults with Jefferson on his plans for the University of Virginia. Jefferson said, "Well, there's nobody better in the world to tell me how we should teach the sciences, which sciences we should teach, what professors we should get, what topics we can expect a good professor to be able to teach." Like, how many topics can a single professor take on? So Priestley was instrumental in helping Jefferson lay the plans for his university that would come several decades later.
Right. And we should say, you're making integration here. Jefferson, another of Jefferson's good buddies, James Madison, of course, was the lead author, maybe the exclusive author of the Bill of Rights. Had written into the First Amendment, freedom of speech, which means, of course, it includes freedom of intellectual expression, and it was perfect for Priestley. Priestley was so controversial, in religion, in politics. Your freedom of speech, written into the Constitution, a guaranteed right, was perfect place for Priestley, and Priestley wrote how the republics, like America, and what France would eventually become, were going to be the breeding grounds for great advance in science and other fields because of this. You don't have to worry about about the king or the monarchy or the aristocracy or the official established church. You don't have to worry about offending them or disagreeing with them and then being hauled off to prison or threatened with this, that, the other thing. In a constitutional republic that constitutionally guarantees freedom of speech, this is going to be, the hotbed of intellectual advance, and Priestley was, absolutely right about that, and we got to give credit to the American founders. Jefferson and Madison, of course, were slave owners. Boo, we're down with that, but they weren't only slave owners, and I wouldn't pull down statues of Jefferson and Madison, right? We just criticize slavery and human slavery and their participation in it. but celebrate freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Yeah, of course, when Madison wrote right into the First Amendment, freedom of religion, the disestablishment clause. Again, this kind of stuff literally saves the lives of people like Joseph Priestley.
Yeah, and we should recall too that Priestley arrived in America just around the time that Jefferson was elected. So before him was John Adams, and Adams had signed into law the Alien and Sedition Acts. So when Priestley comes over, Jefferson writes to him and he says, "It is with heartfelt satisfaction that in the first moments of my public action as president, I can hail you with welcome to our land, tender to you the homage of its respect and esteem, cover you under the protection of those laws which were made for the wise and the good like you, and disdain the legitimacy of that libel and legislation which under the form of law was for some time placed among them." So here he's saying, you have the full protection. You don't have to worry about these laws that Adams had passed. You're going to be protected here in the U.S.
Right. The protege had come to the promised land. This is the perfect place for Priestley. The two bands at the end of his life, like you said, maybe he had a decade of health in the United States, but this was the right place for an extremely controversial person like Priestley. We should point out a few other things that Priestley did before we run out of time. I didn't know. I mean, I'm a great admirer of Priestley and the Lunar Society and all these great minds of the 18th century Enlightenment. I did not know that he was also one of the leading grammarians, of the period. They wrote a book on grammar that evidently was a real advance in the field of English grammar.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. When William Blackstone wrote his Laws of England, he criticized, he said that anyone who was a dissenter could not be a loyal subject. And among other things, Priestley criticized his interpretation of the laws, but also corrected his grammar and really kind of shamed him.
Oops.
And so
that's embarrassing.
Later editions of his History of the Laws of England, Blackstone made several changes based on the criticisms of Priestley. Another, claim to fame for Priestley is he's the father of the soft drink.
Right.
He created carbonated water.
Yeah, that's right, and that's no small thing. But let's start with some of the details here, because you're right. Priestley was the one who figured out how to carbonate water and create, what today is club soda, seltzer, carbonated water. Jakob Schweppe, or Schweppes in English, founded the Schweppes company based on he and his daughter, Schweppe, and his daughter Colette, I think her name was, founded Schweppes, is the English pronunciation, to make carbonated water, made a fortune in commercializing it, and credited Priestley as the father of that industry. Now, later on, here, let me read something else from Catman, from the Capitalist Manifesto, that a lot of people don't know. So this is the creation of a soft drinks industry in the 19th century, because is based on this. Let's get down to the bottom here. So the advances made by Priestley, and then the commercialization of it by Schweppe, made possible. Anybody know John Stitt Pemberton? Anybody know that name? John Stitt Pemberton created Coca-Cola in 1886, but the one I really like here is Caleb is American. Caleb Bradham, Bradham. Caleb Bradham created a drink in the 1890s. He called it Brad's drink, and it became enormously popular. But because Bradham thought that Brad's drink cured dyspepsia, he renamed it Pepsi Cola. And so you're right. You're absolutely right that Priestley, in developing the process to carbonate water, and Jakob Schweppe, who commercialized it, but acknowledged Priestley as the father of the carbonated water industry, made possible Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, and all the soft drink industry. But the real important point, John, that a lot of people don't realize is life-giving point, is that back then they didn't have the technology to clean, to purify the drinking water. Drinking the water was dangerous. That's why in so many countries, these copious amounts of alcohol was consumed. Beer in Northern Europe, wine in Southern Europe. In the United States, the 19th century, it was known as the Alcohol Republic. Paul Johnson. So much booze was consumed. It wasn't just because people were booze hounds. The water was dangerous. You're out on a Pioneer out in pushing through the Cumberland Gap. The drinking water was dangerous because it was impossible to keep human or animal feces. There was no water mains and sewer mains that required steel and advances in technology. And so, animal waste products in the water, or human waste products, once you built a village, and stuff, led to all these horrible diseases, of tainted water, cholera, dysentery, all these diseases that killed so many people. Lots of people die from, still all around the world from drinking, tainted water in third world countries. Carbonated water made the drinking water much safer. And so, whether it was sweetened, with various formulas like in Coca-Cola later and Pepsi-Cola later, or it was just straight seltzer, just straight club soda, the water was much safer to drink than out of the streams. The carbonated process helped purify it. So Priestley and Schweppe, who commercialized the method, saved a lot of lives. And then we got to give credit here, for that. I don't think a lot of people realize that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Among his many accomplishments, father of the soft drink, discoverer of oxygen, liberal political theorist, modernizer of education. He's just an incredible hero.
Yeah, advances in grammar, in English grammar. You're one of the great grammarians, just as a kind of sideline thing. But I gotta say, we gotta salute Priestley. This, like his buddy Franklin, this brilliant, and Jefferson, these brilliant 18th century polymaths, or masters of different, intellectual fields. But my favorite aspect of Priestley's career, what we discussed, the belief that there's the only elements of religion that we should accept are the ones that correspond to our experience of nature. I got to salute Priestley. But he's a minister. He's a minister. Was he tell that to his flock on Sunday morning? They go, why? What does that do with all the miracles of the Bible? It just eviscerates. It's great. It's great. So you can't make this stuff up. A minister, who's preaching this, the minister scientist preaching this. He if there was going to be a church in Galt's Gulch, Priestley gets my vote to be the minister.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the Enlightenment is just it's just an amazing ferment of intellectual activity, and intellectual activity applied to practical concerns. And I argued in the Capitalist Manifesto, and I'm hardly the only one, that the Industrial Revolution was a direct outgrowth of the Enlightenment, especially the Scottish Enlightenment. And James Watt is an obvious, it's clear example. And really, it's disturbing, how many intellectuals post 19th century reject the Enlightenment, and its advocacy of reason, whether they're influenced by Freud or whoever, and then they believe human beings are dominated by irrational urges or non-rational elements, and they reject the Enlightenment. It's really too bad, because it was a very Greek Aristotelian era, advocating reason, and made all these advances, including in applied science, and improving human life on Earth, just carbonating water and making it possible to drink water and not have to drink so much alcohol. That is in itself is an enormous life-giving advance. It's sad. It's really sad. But in our way, John, we're doing the hero show. We already have celebrated some of these great heroes of the Enlightenment. Benjamin Franklin, now Adam Smith, Joseph Priestley. I mean, just think, what's this, our seventh show? And 3 out of the 7 heroes were all 18th century Enlightenment figures. I mean, that's really telling. And we could do Jefferson and Madison, at some point also, some of the 2 of the leading minds of the American Enlightenment.
Well, I'm sure we could do an entire podcast just devoted to heroes of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was just such a life-giving era of human history. And thanks to people like Priestley, we have very good documentation of the sort of thinking that was going on that made these advances possible. We have their letters going back and forth between these guys talking about the advancement of science, all documented in his history and present state of electricity.
Right. And yeah, I mean, this is Priestley is truly, an extraordinary, all around genius. I love the word polymath, for this, genius in all different fields, religion, science, grammar, is just. Oh, and we should also stress that he was, a true liberal in politics. The liberal back then meant, and logically should mean, the LIB root is liberty, is the same root as liberty, and recognized, that individual rights and political economic liberty is, these are great values, and that's what the term liberal means. Liberal is corrupted if it's applied to Bernie Sanders and his, these socialist or semi-socialist welfare statists. Priestley was a true supporter of individual rights, freedom of intellectual expression, freedom of religion. I mean, he was, in fact, I think Priestley wrote, you're more of an expert on Priestley than I am, John, right? Didn't Priestley write that religion and education both were matters for private individuals and private conscience, and the government should just be kept out of those 2 all important fields?
Yeah, he was one of the first to make this distinction between the civil or the political sphere and the private sphere. He said, government has no bearing over religion. Now, I think in part he was very influenced in this by John Locke's letter on toleration. Locke made a very
certainly a good person. Certainly a good person to be influenced by on the, on this issue. Locke, of course, 17th century, right? 1632 to 1704 are Locke's days, 17th century age of reason. But sometimes those 2 periods, 17th and 18th centuries, are just lumped together, as broadly speaking, as an era committed to reason. And Locke was an Anglican, if I recall, and certainly a practicing Protestant Christian. But the terminology of the day, what we call religious fanatics during the 17th and 18th century, they called enthusiasts. I love that terminology. These, fire and brimstone, Bible beaten, just religious zealots. They called them enthusiasts. I love it. Locke was certainly not an enthusiast. He was, this mixture of Christianity and Aristotle, and the Aristotelian element, focus on observable fact, and reason. The Aristotelian, and every man and every woman has this capacity. So the Aristotelian element was very strong in Locke, and you see it all through the 17th and 18th century. I mean, I think you were pointed out Arthur Herman, right, in his book, was it Light in the Cave, where he shows the contest between Plato and Aristotle over the centuries. The 18th century Enlightenment is a very Aristotelian period. And by the way, while we're on the topic of Arthur Herman, one of his other books, How the Scots Invented the Modern World, is a great
one of my favorite books.
Yeah, it's a great book on the Scottish Enlightenment and the practical benefits and how it leads to the British Industrial Revolution. You discuss James Watt and Adam Smith. Of course, Andrew Carnegie comes out of that background. It is How the Scots Invented the Modern World is one of Arthur Herman's books. It was a great book. Herman was a historian at the Smithsonian, wasn't he? As I recall.
I actually don't know, but I think he's still alive. So if he was, maybe he still is.
Yeah. I think he was at the Smithsonian and maybe still is. Yeah. So I know we're running out of time, but maybe, let's drop the maybe. some point in the future, let's do a whole show on Enlightenment heroes. There's so many of them, and we touched upon a few already. Franklin, Smith, Priestley, and then there's some of these great minds of the Lunar Society, like
James Watt,
yeah,
Wedgwood,
Watt, Bolton, Wedgwood. So many, so many.
Many of whom were fervent abolitionists as well. I mean, they were there at the forefront of the abolition movement in England. Wedgwood, especially.
Yeah, not a surprise. The Enlightenment was what gave rise to the abolition, the rights of man, as it was known during the 18th century Enlightenment. What we call individual rights is what gave rise to the abolitionist movement. And a number of historians acknowledge that although politically the leading abolitionists were very religious and clergymen, like William Wilberforce, that Wilberforce was very well aware of Enlightenment thinking on this. And it was let's put it this way: Christianity, religion, clergymen, they'd been around for centuries, and hadn't developed an abolitionist movement. Why now? I think the question we should always ask is, why here and why now? And the answer to that in this context is because the Enlightenment, these rational thinkers, these Aristotelian thinkers of the Enlightenment, gave rise to the theory of the rights of man, and influenced many of the better thinkers in Christianity. And Priestley's one. I mean, he's striding both camps, right? Religion and science, secularism, and not faith, but secularism and religion. I guess you can't call Priestley a man of faith when he said the only religious truths are the ones that correspond to our experience of nature. Because that's a great quote. I love that. Yeah, we got to do a show on the Enlightenment, the heroes of the Enlightenment, John.
Well, I think we could do dozens of shows on the heroes of the Enlightenment, and we certainly will. I think it's also worth pointing out that the Aristotelian strain is this inductive approach to reality, this approach whereby men rely on reason. And it's just kind of a funny accident of history that Aristotle had become, and I know you're an expert on this, Andy, you can speak to it better than I can, but Aristotle had become sort of the poster child of the medieval scholastic Christian movement. They had adopted some of his ideas as dogma and basically gotten rid of the really life-serving stuff. So just kind of a funny thing that a lot of these Enlightenment thinkers were, they attacked Aristotle, or they at least attacked the elements of Aristotle that the scholastics had put forward as Aristotle.
Yeah, the scholastics, of course, early on, 12th and 13th centuries, people like Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas did a great deal of good in reintroducing Aristotle into the into medieval Christian world, and directly brought about what they call the medieval Renaissance, which feeds, of course, into the Italian Renaissance. But as the time went on, the scholastics were Christian Aristotelians, and they admired Aristotle, and legitimately so. But they were also Christians, and they used the religious method. They treated Aristotle's writings and the content of Aristotle as though he were a church father, not to be questioned. You can't question, the Jesus in the Gospels. You can't question Paul. You can't question Aristotle. It was dogma at that point. And the key point here was what you were saying, John. The scholastics rejected Aristotle's method. They upheld his content as a dogma, identical to the church founders. But Aristotle's method was inductive. You're absolutely right. It means empirical. You start with the observation of nature, and then you apply logical thinking to the observation of nature. Galileo himself, caught in a death struggle with scholastics in his time. Galileo's dates were 1564 to 1633. I think late 17th century, late 16th, early 17th centuries. Galileo caught in a death struggle with these scholastics who were reciting Aristotle like it was the Bible, in a doctrinaire, dogmatic method. Galileo himself said, if Aristotle were here, he'd look through the telescope. He said, Aristotle, out of respect for observable facts, you don't. You know, and Galileo was absolutely right. So the Enlightenment thinkers were criticizing some of the content of Aristotle's work, and and properly so. But maybe they didn't even realize it themselves while employing the single most important element of Aristotle, his method. The observation, fact-based method. That reasoning, logical thinking has to be applied to observable fact, not faith-based beliefs, not mythology. There's Aristotle's advance, and Arthur Herman recognizes that in that the Enlightenment's an Aristotelian period. He recognizes that in his book, The Cave and the Light. By the way, one last thing. I know we're running out of time, John. You brought up these philosophic points. Peter Gay is one of the leading historians of the Enlightenment. Massive. That's not massive. It's a 2-volume work on the Enlightenment. And notice the titles of the 2 volumes. Volume 1 is the rise of modern paganism. So the rise of modern paganism. And he realizes that these 18th century thinkers weren't literally polytheists, but when he talks about the rise of modern paganism, he means they're Greek, and primarily Aristotelian. They're committed to reason, an observation-based reason. And Locke, of course, is seminal in that era. And volume 2 was the science of freedom. Again, the rights of man, limited constitutional government, development of laissez-faire economics, or almost laissez-faire economics, in the hands of Adam Smith. And so the Enlightenment is, Peter Gay is right. The Enlightenment is a very Greek period, and Aristotle is the seminal influence here in the most important way: method. Well, I mean, we could go on and on discussing the Enlightenment heroes, but I think we've done, we've saluted Priestley and the great minds of the Lunar Society of Birmingham. I guess we could call it a wrap and come back, next week, or certainly in the future, with a show on the Enlightenment itself, or on some of its leading American members. Like we already did Benjamin Franklin. We could certainly do Thomas Jefferson and James Madison also.
Yeah, and if you guys have suggestions, here's you'd like to see us cover, email me at john@objectivestandard.org.
John, may you have a heroic day, my brother.
You as well, Andy.
All right, guys, let's sign off. We will be back next week with more heroes to discuss. Have a heroic day, everybody, and a heroic life while we're at it.